Greg had always thought of himself as better than others. He came from a rich family, traveled to many countries, and never cared about learning new cultures. He believed that his money and status made him untouchable. On a bright afternoon in London, Greg and his friends arrived at Buckingham Palace, eager to see the famous royal guards. The large palace gates stood tall, and tourists gathered, taking pictures of the guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. The guards stood perfectly still, not moving an inch, no matter how many people stared at them. Greg smirked. "I bet I can make one of them blink," he said, nudging his friend. His friends laughed. They had heard that the royal guards were not allowed to react to anything. Greg saw this as a challenge. They walked closer, pushing past other tourists. Greg noticed one particular guard, a tall, strong-looking black man standing firm in his position. His name was Elijah, though Greg did not know or care about that. To Greg, he was just another guard, someone below him. Greg turned to his friends. "Watch this," he whispered, grinning, provoking the guardsman. Greg first tried simple tricks to get a reaction from Elijah. He waved his hand in front of Elijah's face. No reaction. He made silly faces, sticking out his tongue. Nothing. Other tourists noticed what he was doing. Some frowned, disapproving of his childish behavior. A woman shook her head, muttering, "So disrespectful." But Greg didn't care. Then he took things further. "This guy doesn't even blink," Greg joked loudly, pointing at Elijah. "Hey, can you hear me? Are you even real?" His friends laughed loudly, encouraging him. Greg felt even bolder. "You don't belong here, man," he said, looking Elijah up and down. "I thought the Queen's guards were supposed to be. I don't know British." Some people gasped. A few stepped away, sensing that Greg was crossing a line. Elijah, however, remained perfectly still. Tension builds. Greg wasn't satisfied. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to prove that he could make the guard break his discipline. So he leaned in closer and whispered, "Do you even speak English?" Still, Elijah didn't move. Greg rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. You're just standing there like a statue. Bet you wish you were somewhere else." Another tourist, a young man with a camera, spoke up. "Hey, leave him alone," he said firmly. Greg turned and snapped, "Mind your own business." Elijah remained silent. His training had prepared him for situations like this. He was strong, disciplined, and focused. But inside, he knew one thing. If Greg took things any further, there would be consequences. And Greg was about to make a big mistake. Greg stood in front of Elijah, feeling powerful. He had been trying to make the royal guardsman react for a while, but nothing worked. The guard remained still as a statue, ignoring Greg's words and actions. Greg's friends were laughing, enjoying the show. Other tourists watched in silence, some uncomfortable with the way Greg was behaving. But Greg didn't care. He saw this as a game, one he was determined to win. "This guy's no fun," Greg smirked, looking at his friends. "Maybe he's not even human." His words made a few people gasp, but Greg just grinned. He had spent his whole life thinking he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Elijah, however, remained professional. His training had taught him to ignore all distractions. No matter what people said, no matter how rude they were, his duty was to stand firm and protect the palace. But Greg wasn't done. Crossing the line, Greg stepped even closer, now only inches away from Elijah. He waved a hand in front of the guard's face again. Nothing. Then, Greg suddenly reached out and grabbed Elijah's hat. A loud gasp spread through the crowd. Everyone knew the royal guard's uniform was sacred. Touching it was completely disrespectful. The guard's tall black hat, known as a bearskin, was a symbol of tradition and honor. And Greg had just crossed a major line. Elijah still didn't move, but those who knew about the royal guard could see a shift in his stance. A warning. Greg chuckled, thinking he was in control. "Oh, come on," he said, twirling the hat in his fingers. "It's just a hat. What's the big deal?" The crowd was no longer just watching. They were growing angry. A woman took out her phone to record. A man whispered, "This guy's in serious trouble." Greg ignored them. He was enjoying himself. The final push. Feeling even bolder, Greg did something even worse. He placed the hat on his own head, striking the silly pose. The crowd murmured loudly. This was beyond disrespectful now. The Royal Guard was a symbol of honor and discipline, and Greg was treating it like a joke. Still, Elijah remained still. But Greg wanted more. He wanted to see just how far he could push the limit. So, he tapped Elijah's shoulder. Then he shoved him, just slightly. The moment Greg's hand made contact with Elijah's uniform, the entire energy of the place changed. Elijah took a single step forward. The crowd went silent. Greg froze, feeling something shift in the air. For the first time, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. Greg felt a rush of confidence as he shoved Elijah's shoulder. He thought it would just be another joke, another way to show off in front of his friends. But something changed in Elijah's stance. The guardsman didn't speak, but his body moved with precision, as if he had been waiting for the moment when someone would finally cross the line. The crowd fell silent, and the tension in the air was suddenly thick. Everyone could sense that this wasn't a playful moment anymore. Greg, for the first time, felt a chill run down his spine. But he didn't stop. "Hey, I'm just messing around," Greg said, laughing, trying to brush off the growing discomfort. "You're just standing there like a robot. Relax." His friends laughed, but there was no laughter from the crowd anymore. Everyone had stopped recording, and some people began to walk away, unsure if they wanted to see how far this would go. Elijah took another step forward, his boots clacking sharply against the stone ground. His eyes, still focused ahead, never wavered. It was clear he was now taking the situation seriously. Greg noticed the change in Elijah's posture and realized, with a shock, that he was facing someone who was not afraid. He had underestimated the power of discipline, and now he could feel the strength behind it. Still, Greg was determined to keep going. "You think you're better than me because you wear a silly hat," Greg sneered, now standing directly in front of Elijah. "I bet I can make you do something." Elijah didn't flinch. He simply raised his chin, standing even taller. His eyes still stared straight ahead, but his body had grown more rigid. There was a quiet power in the way he moved. For a brief moment, Greg thought Elijah might speak or shout something back. But instead, the guard's silent response made everything feel even more intense. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to get Greg in trouble. He was just waiting, ready to act when necessary. Greg felt an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the situation. He had provoked someone who had the strength to stop him if necessary. Yet, Greg pushed on, his ego refusing to back down. "You don't scare me," Greg muttered, his voice wavering just slightly. He reached out to touch Elijah's uniform again. But this time, his hand was shaking. He had gone too far. Elijah suddenly stepped back, his boots making a louder sound as he adjusted his position. He took a deep breath, and Greg could see the muscles in his arms tense under his uniform. Elijah wasn't just waiting anymore. He was now preparing himself. The tension between the two men was palpable. The crowd, though still silent, was watching with wide eyes, anticipating what would happen next. In that brief moment of stillness, Greg realized he had done something he couldn't undo. Elijah wasn't just a royal guardsman. He was a symbol of respect, discipline, and authority. Greg had crossed a line, and now he would have to face the consequences. The air around Greg seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He had no idea what had just shifted. It was as though something invisible had changed, and he no longer felt in control. Elijah had stepped back, his posture even more imposing now, and Greg could feel the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. But Greg was stubborn. He had been embarrassed earlier when Elijah didn't react to his mockery, and now he was angry. He couldn't let himself look weak in front of his friends or the crowd. They were all watching him, and he couldn't back down. He took a step closer, his confidence returning, but now it was tinged with arrogance. "Hey, I'm just playing around," Greg said, though his voice lacked the boldness it had earlier. "Don't get all serious on me. I thought you were a statue, but maybe you're just a man after all." Elijah didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his face calm but his body alert. The way he stood showed the calmness of someone who had been trained to deal with situations like this. He wasn't angered, just focused, as though he was waiting for Greg to make another mistake. Greg didn't understand. He thought he could just keep pushing. He thought that if he kept talking, kept provoking, he would eventually make Elijah crack. But the guardsman didn't react. Greg felt the heat rise in his cheeks. "Come on, you can't be this serious," Greg muttered under his breath. "I'm just having fun. You're just a guy in a fancy uniform." That was when Greg made his fatal mistake. Greg raised his hand toward Elijah's uniform once again, this time with the intention of grabbing the guard's collar. He reached out, fingers just inches from Elijah's pristine uniform. Before he could even touch it, Elijah's body moved faster than Greg could comprehend. In a swift motion, Elijah grabbed Greg's wrist, holding it firmly without ever losing his calm composure. The crowd around them went completely silent, and for the first time, Greg felt a rush of fear. He couldn't pull his wrist free from Elijah's grip. Elijah wasn't using excessive force. He was simply holding Greg in place, but the strength in his grip made it clear that he wasn't someone to be messed with. "I told you to stop." Elijah's voice was low, but it was filled with authority. There was no anger in his words, only a firm warning. Greg froze, suddenly feeling the weight of his actions. He realized that he had crossed a line he should not have crossed. He tried to pull his wrist back, but Elijah's grip didn't budge. Greg's confidence vanished, replaced by a cold sense of reality. Elijah wasn't someone to make fun of. He wasn't some figure to joke about. He was a man of discipline, strength, and honor, and Greg had tested him too far. Greg's friends, who had been laughing only moments ago, were now silent. Their smiles had faded, replaced by concern. They had watched their friend challenge a royal guardsman and now realized that this wasn't some game. Elijah slowly released Greg's wrist, but he didn't move back. He just stood there, firm and unwavering, his presence stronger than any words could have been. The lesson was clear. Greg stood there, his wrist still tingling from Elijah's grip. His heart was pounding, and a sudden sense of realization washed over him. He had just tried to mess with someone who was far beyond his understanding. Elijah wasn't like anyone Greg had dealt with before. Greg wanted to say something, to make a joke or maybe apologize, but his words got caught in his throat. The strength in Elijah's hands had not been brutal, but it was unshakable, and the intensity of Elijah's presence made Greg feel smaller than he ever had before. Elijah didn't say another word. He didn't need to. His silence was more powerful than any words could have been. Greg knew that the situation had gone beyond just mockery. It wasn't funny anymore. Elijah had shown him just how serious he could be, and Greg felt a tingling unease spread through him. The crowd around them was now watching with wide eyes. Some people had already started whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the way Greg had been behaving. Others were watching Elijah, almost in awe, as though waiting for him to make the next move. But Elijah didn't move. He simply stood tall, his gaze steady, focused, and calm. He was a royal guardsman, trained for moments like this. He wasn't here to entertain or engage in petty games. His job was to protect and represent, to stand firm in the face of disrespect or provocation, and he had done exactly that. Greg shifted his weight from foot to foot, unsure of what to do next. His friends had stopped laughing. They had probably realized that they had misjudged the situation. No one could have predicted just how serious this moment would become. Greg looked at Elijah again, and for the first time, he felt a deep sense of respect. He had been wrong. Elijah wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was a symbol of strength and dignity, someone who had earned his place with years of training, discipline, and self-control. I didn't mean anything by it, Greg stammered, trying to find his words. I was just messing around. Elijah didn't reply. His eyes didn't leave the front. He hadn't shown any anger, but there was a clear message in his silence. Sometimes, not reacting was the most powerful way to handle things. Greg looked around at the crowd. No one was laughing anymore. In fact, several people were shaking their heads in disapproval, and some were still filming. The realization that his actions were being watched by so many people started to sink in. He had tried to humiliate Elijah, but now he was the one who felt humiliated. Greg shifted his eyes back to Elijah, this time with a new sense of understanding. Elijah hadn't needed to speak or even move aggressively. He had simply stood his ground, and that alone had been enough to stop Greg. It was clear that Elijah was not someone to be tested, and the power in that message was undeniable. Greg stood there, caught between embarrassment and regret, knowing that the situation could have been very different if he had just respected Elijah from the start. The silence that followed felt like a weight hanging in the air. Greg stood there, looking at Elijah, unsure of what would happen next. His friends were silent, no longer laughing or making jokes. The energy around them had completely shifted. What had started as a fun challenge had turned into something serious. As Greg's mind raced, he heard footsteps approach. It wasn't long before two security officers arrived, walking briskly toward the scene. They were tall, dressed in dark blue uniforms, and their expressions were serious. The crowd parted as they made their way through, heading straight for Greg. One of the officers spoke firmly. "Sir, you need to step away." Greg blinked, still trying to process what was happening. He had thought he could just get away with a few jokes, but now it seemed like he was in more trouble than he had imagined. I was just having a laugh," Greg said, his voice a little shakier now. "I didn't mean anything bad. Just playing around." The officer didn't respond to his explanation. Instead, he spoke directly to Elijah, his attention now fully focused on the guardsman. "Is everything all right, sir?" Elijah, still standing tall and unmoved, gave a small nod. His expression was calm but firm. "Everything is fine," he replied, his voice low but clear. "But this man touched my uniform and made several disrespectful comments." The officer nodded, taking out a notepad to make a quick note. Meanwhile, Greg's heart was pounding faster. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him. Some were looking at him with pity, others with disapproval, but no one was laughing anymore. "Sir, please come with us," the officer instructed Greg. The situation had escalated so quickly. Greg's confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. Now he was just a tourist who had crossed a line, and there were consequences. The officer's words felt like a final judgment. Greg glanced at his friends, but they were standing back, silent and uncomfortable. They didn't know how to react either. They had all been part of the game, but now the fun was over. As Greg was escorted away by the officers, the crowd began to murmur again, some talking about what had just happened, others shaking their heads. They couldn't believe someone had been disrespectful enough to provoke a royal guardsman like that. Greg tried to explain to the officers again, but his words didn't seem to matter much. Elijah had made it clear that the situation had already gone too far. The guardsman didn't even need to do anything more. His calm and collected response had been enough to show that Greg's actions were wrong. As Greg was taken away, he could still hear the quiet chatter of the crowd, some of them talking about the lesson they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about respecting a guard's uniform. It was about recognizing the consequences of disrespecting others, no matter who they were. Greg didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. He would never forget this moment. He had learned the hard way that there was more to life than jokes and games, especially when it came to respecting people and their roles. The incident at Buckingham Palace quickly became the talk of the town. The video of Greg's behavior, And the calm but powerful response of Elijah spread rapidly online. People couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The shocking images of a tourist mocking a royal guardsman were shared on social media, accompanied by disapproving comments and discussions about respect and privilege. Greg had become an example, and not in the way he had hoped. News outlets picked up the story, and soon enough, his name was linked with disrespect, not only to the guards, but also to the British military tradition. He had embarrassed himself in front of the entire world, and there was no escaping it. Meanwhile, Elijah remained as composed as ever. He didn't comment on the situation, nor did he seek any attention. His duty was to serve with dignity, and that was exactly what he had done. His professionalism had spoken for itself. He was not just a guardsman standing at attention. He was someone who carried the weight of respect and responsibility. Though the incident had drawn criticism, it also sparked a much-needed conversation about respect for others, regardless of their background or position. Many people praised Elijah for his calmness and discipline, noting how he had handled the situation with grace. It was a reminder that sometimes silence and restraint are the most powerful responses to provocation. Greg, on the other hand, was facing the consequences of his actions. The police had taken him in for questioning, and soon it became clear that his actions had serious consequences. Greg had broken laws regarding respecting public figures and their roles. While he didn't face violent consequences, the charges and the public backlash made him realize that his behavior had been unacceptable. He tried to defend himself in interviews, but it was too late. People had seen the video, and the damage had been done. His friends, who had laughed along with him earlier, now seemed to be keeping their distance. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had caused such a public scene. Greg's family was embarrassed, and they were forced to make statements apologizing for his actions. They had tried to teach him better, but his sense of entitlement had blinded him. It was a hard lesson for Greg to swallow, but he had no choice but to face the reality of the situation. As for Elijah, he was praised by his peers and fellow guards. Many sent him messages of support, recognizing the difficult position he had been put in. Elijah wasn't seeking recognition, but the praise he received reminded him that his commitment to professionalism had not gone unnoticed. He had upheld the values of his position, and in doing so, had earned the respect of those around him. The whole experience made Greg realize that some lessons had to be learned the hard way. He had thought that he could simply mock someone without consequence, but the reality was much more serious. As he faced the consequences of his actions, Greg knew that it was time to rethink his behavior and how he treated those around him. And for the rest of the world, the incident served as a reminder that respect for others, no matter their job or background, was essential in building a better, more understanding society. The day after the incident, Greg woke up with a heavy heart. His phone was filled with messages, but none of them were supportive. Instead, his inbox was filled with news articles and messages from people who had watched the video of his interaction with Elijah. The video was everywhere, and Greg was suddenly famous, but for all the wrong reasons. His family had called him early that morning, clearly upset. They had seen the news, and they were disappointed. Greg's parents were known in their community for their good reputation, and now their son was in the spotlight for the wrong reasons. He hadn't just embarrassed himself, he had embarrassed his family. Greg sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, reading through the comments. Many people were critical of his behavior, calling it childish, disrespectful, and rude. He could feel the sting of their words, and deep down, he knew they were right. What he had done to Elijah was unacceptable. But what hit Greg the hardest were the comments about his privilege. Many people pointed out that Greg had acted this way because he thought his wealth and status gave him the right to do whatever he wanted. He had taken his position in life for granted, and the consequences were staring him in the face. In the days that followed, Greg was questioned by the police and had to deal with the legal side of things. While he wasn't facing serious charges, he still had to explain his actions. The officers told him that his behavior could have been considered an assault, given how he had physically touched Elijah's uniform. The royal guards were protected by law, and Greg's actions had been disrespectful not just to Elijah but to the entire institution. Greg had to deal with public humiliation as well. He could no longer walk down the street without hearing whispers behind his back. People recognized him from the news, and not in a good way. He was the tourist who thought he could mess with the royal guardsman. He couldn't hide from his actions anymore. His friends, who had once laughed along with him, now kept their distance. They didn't want to be associated with someone who had caused such a scene. Greg realized that the people around him weren't just disappointed with his actions, they were embarrassed by him. One evening, after a long day of dealing with messages and phone calls, Greg sat down and watched the video again. This time, he paid attention to Elijah's calmness. The way the guardsman had handled the situation with such restraint and dignity was something Greg hadn't truly understood at the time. Elijah didn't need to raise his voice or use force. His silence and strength were enough to make Greg realize how wrong he had been. It was at that moment that Greg understood the lesson he had learned the hard way. He had let his privilege cloud his judgment, thinking that he could treat people however he wanted. But Elijah had shown him something important. That true strength came from respect, self-discipline, and restraint. Greg knew that it would take time to rebuild his reputation. He would have to prove to himself and others that he was capable of change. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make things right. Weeks passed, and life slowly began to return to normal for Greg, but the memory of that day at Buckingham Palace still haunted him. He had spent days reflecting on his behavior, his attitude, and the lessons he had learned. He realized that what happened wasn't just about the royal guardsman Elijah or his own public embarrassment. It was about something much deeper, a lesson in respect. The incident had brought to light not only Greg's disrespectful actions, but also the privileges that he had taken for granted. It wasn't just about making a joke at someone else's expense. It was about understanding that people in positions of authority and service deserved the same level of respect as anyone else. Greg had thought he was above others because of his status, but Elijah had shown him that respect wasn't about power. It was about dignity, discipline, and treating others with kindness. Greg had made a promise to himself. He would work hard to change his ways. The first step was admitting his mistakes and apologizing to Elijah, though he knew that Elijah's dignity and professionalism didn't require an apology. Greg didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped to learn from this mistake and become a better person. The video of the incident had reached millions, and while many had criticized Greg, there were also people who admired Elijah for handling the situation with grace and strength. Social media users praised Elijah for standing firm and remaining calm, reminding others that discipline was a powerful response to provocation. People saw Elijah as a symbol of self-control and honor, and Greg began to understand why. Greg realized that the true strength didn't come from forcing people to respect you, but from earning that respect through your actions. The way Elijah had stood his ground, without anger, without shouting, without violence, showed Greg what it meant to be strong, calm, and composed in the face of adversity. In the weeks that followed, Greg used his experience to educate himself. He began reading books on empathy, respect, and understanding different perspectives. He learned that the world wasn't just about him, his wealth, and his position. It was about seeing others as equals and understanding the challenges they might face, whether they were royal guards, public servants, or anyone else. Greg's family also took time to reflect on the situation. They realized that it wasn't just Greg who had been blind to certain privileges. It was a societal issue. They began having conversations about privilege and how they could all do better in being more mindful and respectful of others. As for Elijah, he continued with his duties at Buckingham Palace, never mentioning the incident again. His silence, once again, spoke volumes. He didn't need to prove anything. His actions had already spoken for him. Elijah had shown the world that true strength wasn't about physical force or words. It was about standing tall with integrity and respect. In the end, Greg learned a valuable lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just about apologizing or making things right. It was about changing how you treat others and learning to see the world through their eyes. The incident at Buckingham Palace had shaken him, but it had also given him the chance to grow. And for that, he would always be thankful.